Hello everyone, and welcome to Bus Back Better, Connecting the Stakeholders. My name is Beate Kubitz and I'm a consultant in future mobility. I'm writing a book about mobility as a service at the moment, having edited the annual survey of mobility as a service for Landor Links for 3 years. And I'm also a fellow of the Foundation for Integrated Transport and a lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. For this webinar today, we've got 4 excellent presentations for you from, can I have the next slide, Dan? From Guy Sutherland, who's the Bidding Technical Sales Manager at UrbanThings, Chris Hillcoat, Personal Mobility Programme Lead at Solent Transport, Sheryll Ricketts, the Solutions Consultancy Lead at Littlepay, and Mike Bartram, who's the Bus Policy Advisor at Transport Focus. So I'm looking forward to a nice rounded discussion of data and future mobility and mobility as a service. If we can go to Guy, please. Hi, Guy.
Hi there, good morning.
Hi, Guy. You're on.
Thank you very much. If I could get my first slide up, please. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for dialing in, joining. I'm Guy Sutherland. I'm a Bid and Technical Sales Manager at UrbanThings. I'm going to be setting the scene for today's webinar, talking about Bus Back Better, how Bus Back Better is giving us a chance to connect all of the stakeholders through shared transport data. So as an overview of the agenda that I'm going to cover today, I'm going to start off by just introducing who we are at UrbanThings, what we do. And then I'm going to take a bit of time to talk about how Bus Back Better has really shone a spotlight on the need for collaboration and why sharing transport data is absolutely critical right now to improve the passenger experience. Following from that, I'm going to take that a little bit further and highlight how the benefits of this data sharing can really enable complete MaaS platforms beyond just bus. If I could have the next slide, please. So firstly, who are we? Fundamentally, we exist to make travel simple. We are UrbanThings. Next slide, please. We're a technology company based in London. We've been deploying mobility as a service and transport platforms for over 10 years now, deploying both business to consumer and business to business, with our business to consumer offering being the UK's largest independent bus times and ticketing application. We power over 100 million journeys a year at the moment. Next slide, please. The technology we deliver is tied together and delivered as Urban Hub, which is a smart mobility platform. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time now giving an overview of what that platform does. If I could have the next slide, please. Urban Hub is the central platform and a technology engine which powers a number of surrounding modules which join onto this. And these can be plugged in and configured modularly to suit the needs of the city, the operator, and the passenger. And this can range all the way, whether it's a single small operator who just wants to have mobile ticketing on their buses, all the way out to a full regional, multi-operator, multimodal mobility platform. The platform's built upon APIs, which allows it to be open and flexible, and it gives us the ability to integrate different partners to allow us to innovate with new modes and different technology options. Next slide, please. When it's fully deployed, the platform provides a feature-rich set of tools for both the passenger, the authority, and the operators. And all of this is built on that fundamental foundation of shared data. On the passenger side, this shared integrated data allows us to present clear and simple real-time information, enable ticket purchase and reservations, and even offer deeper insights, such as the predicted occupancy of a vehicle when it arrives at your stop. And this overcomes the difficulty in a passenger journey that's created by multiple different operators having different configurations of apps and onboard technology to provide a single source of real-time information and ticketing. For the operator and the authority, we can provide a single source of information for where your vehicles are at any one moment, what the occupancy and route of that vehicle is, as well as detailed analytics of how the passengers are using that system and using the app. And the key here is that it puts everything in one place for the passenger and one place for the city, with no need to switch between 3 different apps to make a single journey or jump between different back offices to understand how passengers are moving around. Have the next slide, please. So this leads on to the need for shared transport data and why now. Next slide. Firstly, Bus Back Better mandates this. Bus Back Better mandates cooperation between operators. All of these operators currently today have different systems, different onboard hardware, different applications, different information feeds, and different back offices. And this means that all of the data and the information is siloed in different places, and it's not accessible. This creates a need for a single source of truth to improve the passenger experience and enable multi-operator and even cross-modal platforms. Now, historically, operators didn't want to share this data. Two operators might not want to have each other's buses or each other's tickets in their app. They might not want to share a back office. But the landscape is changing now to be a much more collaborative environment, because this isn't a battle between different bus operators. This is the battle between public transport and the private car. And by sharing the data, we can in turn connect those stakeholders through simple platforms and make it much more attractive to travel by bus and alternative mobility modes. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? We do this by centralizing all of the data, using standardized feeds and formats, and then sharing this data out with cities, operators, and passengers through standardized simple interfaces, including an account-based application and web portals. This way, all of the data that's spread around the system, all over the ecosystem, can be combined in a single place to simplify journeys and give these stakeholders a connection to each other. Next slide, please. So to facilitate this, we have created the UrbanThings Mobility Charter, which is developed to help stakeholders see what data they need to share, why they need to share it and how to share it, and what they're going to get in return. And this is intended to be a schema which helps facilitate that data sharing between the stakeholders, especially for operators of different sizes and different understandings. We know that there's operators all over the country with completely different levels of knowledge. You know, you have some operators where there's one or two people working together, where one of them might even be driving the bus, all the way up to massive national operators who have entire tech teams dedicated to these sorts of things. And so we've recognized that, and the Mobility Charter is intended to be easily accessible and easy to understand how to implement this transport data sharing. Importantly, it's not about taking data away from anyone. Nobody's trying to steal anyone's data. This is about connecting it together, making that information accessible and uniting the stakeholders against the private car. And we recognize that there's no big bang solution. So this charter is broken down into 3 different levels, which can be deployed starting with what's available today, and that can be built on over time. Next slide, please. So the first level of this is level 1, which starts with the technology and the data and information which is available today. It leverages existing standards such as BODs and Siri feeds, and it's largely available and ready to be switched on. This can create a hybrid deployment of fixed static and live data for passengers to see the buses and routes that are available, and for operators and cities to see where they fit within the ecosystem. Have the next slide, please. As we take this to level 2, this incorporates the existing standards from above, as well as some new agreed standards between stakeholders for this data sharing. And it simplifies the disparate feeds into a single place, a single source of truth. Provides a much richer set of data based on live feeds and information for passengers to really understand what's happening around them, and for cities to see how people are using the system. We go to the next slide, please. The third level is the deepest and the richest integration. And this takes levels 1 and 2 and then builds them to the next level by creating account-based connections for more advanced data insights, both for the passenger and for the city. For example, with the passenger, an account-based connection opens the ability to provide notifications to that passenger as they go through their journey, telling them what trip they're taking, what they're spending, when they're reaching certain spend caps. And for the cities and operators, they can really understand how individuals are moving around and using their city in order to optimize the transport offerings. This also unlocks the ability for multi-operator and even cross-modal connections with this shared data. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is the benefits and the need to share transport data in bus, but it doesn't stop there. If transport data sharing is done right, it can be an enabler for full multimodal MaaS platforms. Next slide, please. The shared transport data can bring real-time information for passengers across modes, all the way from bus and rail to bike docks and other future micromobility modes. And this is a key foundation to providing city or region-wide MaaS, which makes travel for passengers simple and empowers the cities and operators with insights and information that they need to improve their offering and their services. And this can enable a deeper integration further as well. As these data integrations get better, we can go a step further to introduce planning and paying for journeys as well. Next slide, please. So by connecting these transport networks through standardized shared data, it becomes frictionless to bring the data in from around the ecosystem into the back office, and then effortless to pass this out to passengers and to the operators and cities through simple interfaces. And as a result, travel becomes simple and the inertia to move away from the private car can be overcome. Next slide, please. All of this sounds great, right? But it's not just ideas. It's available today and it works. And it's all based on this fundamental philosophy of taking what's available now, deploying it now, and then building on that over time. Can I have the next slide, please? So as an example and a proof point of this, we deployed a multi-operator bus ticketing and RTI platform in Wales, which takes a range of different feeds from vehicles around the country and different onboard hardware, as well as the back office, and consolidates into a simple source of information within an application for finding your vehicles, planning your journeys, seeing what the occupancy of the vehicle you want to get on is, and buying a ticket for that. And this is now being expanded across modes to provide RTI for bike share and rail. Next slide, please. So hopefully this has provided a brief insight into how we think stakeholders can be brought together through shared data to create a truly simple and seamless travel experience. The Mobility Charter is available today, and I encourage you to download it from our website. And then please feel free to reach out and discuss with us how this shared transport data applies to you and how we can help you to leverage this technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. This is just to, before we move on to Chris Hillcoat, just to remind you that we do have questions, which we'll be taking at the end. So we should have at least half an hour at the end of the 4 presentations to cover off questions for Guy and the other speakers. We've got some people who've got the idea already coming in on our inbox. So if you can use, if anyone else in the webinar would like to add their questions, I'll be trying to arrange them and organise them in time for the end of the presentation. So if we can move on to Chris Hillcoat, the Personal Mobility Programme Lead at Solent Transport, to look at how they are dealing with data in the Future Transport Zone. Thanks, Chris.
Hi, good morning, and thank you very much to Landor and to UrbanThings for the invitation to come along today and speak about what we're doing in the Solent region as part of our Future Transport Zone in terms of mobility as a service and some of the other projects that we're looking forward to. So the next slide shows an overview of the programme that we're taking forward, and indeed the geography of that work. So you can see all of the different projects there shown as the different hexagons, with MaaS at the centre of all of our personal mobility projects. And you can see that all of the surrounding projects link quite neatly to the concept of mobility as a service. And on the right hand side there, you can see that Solent Transport is a joint committee of 4 local authorities of Hampshire County Council, Southampton and Portsmouth City Councils, and the Isle of Wight Council. And in the first instance, our MaaS platform will be covering essentially the area shown in the map there. So let's move on to the next slide, where we've got an overview of the key elements of the customer experience that will be in our MaaS platform. you can see here we've got a variety of functions. The first is the journey planner, where we are bringing together all the different modes, of course, public transport, micro-mobility, walking and cycling, and driving. And critically, what we can do in our journey planner is mix them together. And some popular journey planners that many of us will use today don't really allow that multimodal or intermodal trip planning, and ours will. So we're pleased with that, and it's been created and curated specifically for our Solent region. Secondly, on ticketing, we'll be integrating existing public transport tickets across 4 bus companies, National Rail, 3 ferry companies, hovercraft, as well as micro-mobility, so e-scooter rentals, a forthcoming bike share scheme which we're launching next year, and our existing Solent Go card, which is a multi-operator ITSO smart card. And our plan for ticketing is to integrate existing tickets. So we're not at this stage creating new tickets or monthly subscription packages or that sort of idea. But our view is that by creating this framework and integrating everything together, it actually makes it easier to do those integrations in future. Along the bottom there, you can see customer account and payments, other very important elements of a MaaS platform, of course, to make it easy to sign up, to authenticate yourself, to verify your phone, your driving license, to add your payment card, so that it's a really seamless experience for a customer to plan, book, and pay for a journey, and then to take that journey. And finally, we've got an exciting new brand and identity which we're developing, and we are in the process of trademarking that at the moment. It will tie together regional transport in a way that perhaps hasn't been the case hitherto. And so we're really excited to, in the early part of next year, to reveal what that will be. So let's move on to the supporting infrastructure, and you can see here a whole realm of very complex work going on behind the scenes, in order that from a customer perspective it's very simple. We need to make sure that the back office, the integrations, the payment provider, the database and cloud servicing hookups are all there, our smart ticketing functions, data integration. We've heard from Guy already how important that is, and likewise, we're also pulling in data from all sorts of feeds, including BODs and others, so that we have schedule data, real-time data, disruption data across all different modes. And crucially as well, a big element of research and behavioral science, behavioral insights, which is powering our project. So let's move on from the what to then think about the why. So in the next few slides, we've got 3 pillars of why we're developing mobility as a service. And first of all, I'll touch briefly on this idea of transport for all, which is on the next slide. And we're talking here about all types of customers. So different people with different needs, different accessibility requirements, living in different kinds of places, making different kinds of journeys on different modes for different reasons. We want our MaaS platform to be suitable for everyone across all of those different possibilities. And so that includes it includes people with particular needs all the time. It also includes the fact that all of us have particular needs some of the time. So for example, if I'm going on holiday with my family, or I'm traveling with heavy luggage, I have a different journey preference to when I'm just commuting to work and I'm able to, jump on a train really quickly. So transport for all is our first pillar. Our second pillar is around behavior change. And behavior change is a critical element of what we're doing, which is on the next slide, where we talk about some of the strategic challenges of the region around car dependency, heavy congestion on some of our motorways and main roads, quite poor levels of air quality, high emissions. In fact, Portsmouth is just launching a clean air zone, which is an indication of the need that we have. And also, of course, the recovery from COVID-19 as we all slowly emerge from the pandemic and we have slightly changed travel patterns. We want the MaaS platform to be something that enables the behavior change around that. And we have a whole range of transport providers in our region, many of whom are doing excellent work, but we don't have an integrated system. So we don't have, either from a branding perspective or from a ticketing perspective, integrated ticketing, and so that's something that we want to tackle through this project. And we think that the outcomes from this will be that we can develop the first at-scale or multi-city MaaS platform in the UK, a platform designed around what people really need and what people really want, and it will, in doing so, improve and enhance our partnerships with the transport operators and other stakeholders. So let's move on to the final pillar then, which is around research. And here you can see that we've got work with the universities, Portsmouth and Southampton, both of whom have a lot of expertise in fields around UI and UX, around optimization of journey planning algorithms, around sustainability and transport. And there's a real deep partnership that's been going on between Trafi, our provider, and the universities are on that work already. And additionally, the behavioural insights team are coming on board as part of the developer consortium to work on some of those nudges and behavioural science insights that will help make this platform really easy, really attractive, really social to use. We'll be evaluating everything we do, both as a project, also as part of our Future Transport Zone programme, and that is of course in partnership with the DfT who fund this work. And fundamentally, the question I've put at the bottom there, is MaaS viable, and is it viable politically, technically and commercially? Those are the key questions that we want to be able to answer by the end of this Future Transport Zone programme in a few years' time. So we've looked at the why. Let's move on to the next slide where we briefly outline the who or the how of governance. So you can see here that from Solent Transport in the middle, we're controlling the project. We report upwards through our joint committee of the local authorities and to the DfT. We have contracts and technical work with our developer consortium, and additionally with all the third-party integrations around payments and ID verification and so on, making sure the app stores are working in Apple and Android, making sure all the logins are working and so on. And on the bottom there, you can see lots of logos, lots of different transport companies. Each of those represents a contract, a commercial agreement, and a technical integration. And on the left-hand side, the universities and the work that they're doing. So quite a complex picture, quite a complex range of arrangements and relationships that we are tying together. And this is one of the key challenges really, is to move all of these forward at the same time, make sure that everyone remains signed up and attracted to the project as a whole. So that's the who. Let's move on to some of the key issues and challenges, which I've just jotted down here as a note, really, I suppose, that we've already overcome quite a number of challenges. The first one is around what is the proposition, what is the definition of MaaS? And many of you who have been around in this industry for a little while will know that there are as many definitions of mobility as a service as there are people working in it. And so we've chosen what we think is the definition, but that was one of the first challenges to overcome. We've overcome the challenge of procuring a developer and sifting through a lot of companies who are either say they can or actually can deliver a MaaS platform. We've carried out a lot of stakeholder engagement already. At the moment, our current challenges around these three key areas of commercial, contractual and technical. A lot going on right now. We are testing the app. I've got it on my phone. All of the functions are there, they're all working. We're looking to carry out the testing, the bug fixing, making sure that things are working, while at the same time finishing off our data protection assessments and making sure that we are demonstrating the clear commitments we have to protecting people's personal data, and at the same time negotiating agreements with a whole range of operators and providers, which have to be both commercial and contractual agreements. In the future, I think there will be further challenges that we'll face around growing the platform, adding more integrations, adding more features, making sure that we're keeping up with what customers are wanting and expecting, making sure that we build in that commercial viability so that the platform can live on, and potential future challenges with competing platforms. I mean, I think this is one of the key questions that we're probably looking to tackle this morning, is around what does the industry look like? What does it look like when we have multiple providers, public sector, private sector, transport operators, third parties, lots of different visions of MaaS. How do they work together with each other? And how do we create a system where, from a customer perspective, it's really as integrated as it possibly can be? So on my final slide, I've just got a couple of key timescales. You can see that we are well underway with our development and testing work now, looking to launch this publicly in the early part of 2022, first as an open beta test, and then in the spring with a full marketing launch. From then until the summer of 2024, which is the remainder of the Future Transport Zone program, we'll be carrying on our development, we'll be adding new features, iterating the platform continually, facilitating all of that research from the universities, and also looking at the potential for growing the geography of our platform beyond the Solent region, and talking with some of our neighbouring authorities. Post 2024, we hope that there is a potential for the MaaS platform to live on. It will rely on making sure that all of those arrangements are in place, but we are confident that we're creating a system which is really designed around what customers want and what they need, and that it will have a really good chance of living on as a very well used and popular part of the transport system. So that's all from me. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Beate.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, lots of questions coming in, which you will be fielding later on. So some interesting ones specifically about Solent, which hopefully we can move on to after Sheryll and yes. So we've got Sheryll Ricketts next, the Solutions Consultancy Lead for Littlepay. Hi, Sheryll, welcome.
Hi, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. If we can just skip on to the first slide. So we're coming from a slightly different perspective from Guy and from Chris as well, where we're looking at it more from that contactless point of view and the multi-operator aspects of the Bus Back Better strategy that were outlined. Just to give you a bit of an update or an overview of who Littlepay are on the next slide, for anyone who's not familiar with us, we tend to be behind the scenes of things. So since 2016, we set out to try and create a modular-based solution that could bring contactless ticketing to operators of all sizes, 1 bus, 2 bus, 4,000 buses, but in a way where they could link any device they wanted to and any back office system they wanted to deliver contactless payments to their passengers, a sort of evolution of what Transport for London were able to showcase, something that was, I guess, a bit more flexible for the masses. Our journey, you can see in front of us, really began in 2017 when we launched our first deployment with Go Ahead in conjunction with our device partner, Ticketer at the time. And since then, we've just seen exponential growth, and as many of you will be aware, across UK Bus. So we're in quite a unique position in the industry as a whole globally in terms of the coverage that we have in contactless in UK Bus. And anywhere that you go outside of London, we have around about 70% of the bus companies coming to our back office systems to securely process those contactless payments transactions. What's happened as well is we were able to roll out and have that success in the UK, which was wonderful, but it also allowed us to build out that solution to be truly modular, to be able to plug in multiple devices, multiple back offices, as I'd said at the start. And what we're seeing now is that flexibility is really resonating and allowing us to grow internationally in places like Helsinki in North America and now Costa Rica as well. We'll just go on to the next slide and sort of put it into the context of Bus Back Better again. We were delighted to see that vision that was set out, that was really, in our view, trying to unify the nation, to try to make bus something that people would choose to use, not just have to use. And of course, contactless payments, multi-operator ticketing and capping, that's just a small part of that overall picture. But what we'll take you through today is just how we feel we can set some building blocks for that aspect of it, at least, to hopefully try to deliver on some of the initiatives and aspirations that were set out in the strategy. Things like contactless payments on all buses, 100% of major operator fleets now enabled. Fantastic. Many more of the smaller ones are coming daily. The capping initiatives, so that exists. So yes, it exists in Transport for London, we know it well. If you use the service, I do. It's my now home turf, contrary to the accent. But what happened with our capping sort of journey with our operators was that many operators chose to just replicate the paper-based and the prepaid fares initially. That's called Model 1. So the passenger would board the bus and just buy their ticket with a contactless payment. There's ease, simplicity and convenience associated with that. But where we find our operators are now finding the biggest value is that move and that migration to capping, to being able to take away that element of complexity for the passenger where they have to plan ahead, not only what buses are they going to get, what time, but what ticket do they ask for, how do they pay for it. That's no longer a problem when capping is introduced, and to see it as part of this sort of wider strategy to be like a building block of making passengers' lives easier was a delight to us. Also, integrated ticketing across operators, something that we'll tell you about shortly, that's been live since 2019 with one of our operators, Go Ahead. And actually, we've been proving and working on many of the challenges that are associated with that sort of multi-operator vision. We just go on to the next slide. A brief sort of overview of contactless and that actually the Bus Back Better strategy is pushing on an open door. This is a view of our transactions cross-referenced with UK bus journeys across the UK since March 2020, a month we'll all remember very well, I'm sure. Now, as expected, from that middle line, that 0 or pre-COVID transaction volumes, you can see that the bottom just dropped out of the market. That's no surprise to anyone. But what's interesting in this chart is towards the right-hand side of the graph, where actually you can see that turning point around about April this year, where the Littlepay contactless transactions, that's people using contactless on buses, reached our pre-COVID volumes. That's interesting because UK bus journeys hadn't actually fully recovered. They were sitting at around about 60% recovery at that point. And since then, you can see that Littlepay transactions have continued to grow, actually a 50% increase. Now that's not new people using contactless, we don't believe. We believe that that's people who are choosing to use contactless for possibly migrating from previous methods of payment and travel, possibly because of the secure and safe elements of it that's perceived with less interaction with cash handling, etc. But then also with the flexibility that the contactless initiatives offer. Operators have been launching flexible capping and tap on, tap off on our services. And that's given passengers that flexibility to deal with their new working patterns that a sort of new normal has created. Excuse me. One other piece of information that I think will feed quite well, I hope will feed quite well into some of the discussions with our other panelists, is the increase in the use of mobile devices. So actually we've seen a 65% rise in passengers using their mobile wallet to pay. And that's possibly something good that we can discuss later about passengers having that device in their hand that can do so much more than just payment. Okay, we go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to set out the challenges that we've found. So when we did this deployment in 2019 and all of the work that we've done since with partners and operations such as Project Coral, these are the things, the pain points that we were trying to address and things that I guess have to be considered by the nation as a whole as we look to implement multi-operator solutions. The UK by nature has multiple different ticket machines, operating systems, back office systems, payment processing systems, and to offer a multi-operator benefit to a passenger, we need to find a way for all of those systems to work in harmony. The investments that operators have already made in their own contactless payment systems has to be recognised for any solution that's being deployed. Anything that's going to come along and sort of push that to the side and negate the investment that's been made isn't going to be accepted by the operators. That's been proven in previous initiatives that we've tried to do. Anything that's dealing with a payment card, typically you've got to deal with security. And then, of course, the data legislation aspects of it. And then, of course, by nature, when you're pulling different systems together, having a standardized integration plan is necessary, and something that we'll be able to talk about shortly. Revenue apportionment, this will come under the MaaS elements of the discussion as well. It's an interesting one, and one that we'll talk to you about how we've managed to at least make it work in the schemes that we've been involved in, and what we believe are the sort of key ingredients to ensure that accurate revenue apportionment is supported by any multi-operator scheme. But I think the key are the bottom bullet point and the large one in pink at the bottom. And it's all about the customer, really. How do we bring lots of different things together in what I guess could be considered complex in a way that's actually very simple for the passenger, because that's what's going to make it a success. And that's what we'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please. So the solution I alluded to from 2019, with their operator Go Ahead, they brought to us two of their operating companies, Brighton and Hove and Metrobus. They're both distinct operators with their own systems, albeit systems provided by Littlepay. So it made it a simpler proposition to try and bridge the gap and try and address some of those challenges I just spoke about. What we did was bring tap-on, tap-off multi-operator services to passengers in the area. And now we're delighted to say that actually the technology wasn't the difficult part and isn't going to be the difficult part on this journey for us all. The blocks are political, competitive, commercial, but if we can at least help to set that sort of technical foundation, then at least it's something to build upon and fit those other solutions in place. One thing to sort of talk about as well is, do they even make a difference? Does multi-operator even help? The results from Go Ahead's pilot were so successful, as you can see in that sort of green box to the bottom there, showing a migration from cash and even a migration from that retail prepaid mentality into the capping mentality, reduction in dwell time by 30 seconds, and general contactless adoption just increases a whole by 40%. Is showing that, yes, it can make a difference. It can make a difference to operators. It can make a difference to passengers by simplifying things. And actually, it made such a difference that they kept it running, which I think is always a great advocate of that. We can go into the next slide, please. I'm not going to go into the detail of the technical solution, but I wanted to show how it all sort of can sit together. We're saying that you have to respect each individual operator's solution. You can see here you've got two different systems sitting side by side, or at least two different contactless ecosystems. They're dealing with their own payments, they're dealing with the taps coming in from the passenger. The multi-operator solution that we've put in place is that bit that's along the bottom, the broker service. And it should be invisible to the other systems, and it should only pipe up when a multi-operator cap adjustment needs to be made. And in that way, everybody should be able to go along as business as usual, but the passenger will receive that benefit of discounted or multi-operator travel discounts potentially. The key as well, is the reconciliation reporting. So yes, this broker service needs to monitor all of the taps coming in, but it also needs to be the log, the source of truth. Who paid what? Who travelled where? Where did the money land? Where should the money go? And by doing that, all stakeholders within the multi-operator environment should then have the information that they need to settle with one another and ensure that the money goes to the right place. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So just to sort of recap, we've spoke about what we've done in 2019, but we've been busy since then working with initiatives such as Project Coral to try and prove out the solution beyond just Littlepay operators. And we've been able to integrate a back office system from another supplier, which was VIX in this instance, to show that actually taps can be received from multiple ecosystems into this broker service, and the value and the adjustments, the monitoring and the revenue apportionment data can all be provided. Really, we're very excited to be taking that further early next year, where there'll be at least 5 different projects going live across the country to just expand this multi-operator proposition. Move on to the next slide, please. One thing to think about is, it's great, okay, we've got capping, we've got contactless on the buses, we've got multi-operators starting to roll out on MaaS. But what about those who can't participate in a contactless scheme at the moment? The unbanked, the underbanked, even the unwilling. Are they going to be left behind? And I think that's something that we all want to have an answer to. Now, at the moment, EMV is definitely addressing that pay-as-you-go market, delivering capping to try and help the migration of the prepaid masses. But what about discounts, concessions, and of course the unbanked? If we go to the next slide, please, you can see where the EMV technology has evolved. Previously, devices were offline. Everything had to be card-centric, device logic sort of processing and dealing with all of the ticketing aspects. As we've moved online, it's allowed for online payment, or at least for payments processing to exist. And now it evolved even further, where there's things such as card as authority to travel, which can be used and exploited to deliver value to pass holders, entitlement holders. You've got the ability for shared tokens to unlock data across card present and card not present, so that retail channel, to give an omni-channel view of things. And actually, when we've stood back and looked at the broker service proposition, card as authority to travel, and also the shared token, we start to have building blocks that can really enable contactless in a MaaS vision, which isn't necessarily something that's always considered. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, a little bit later in the discussions. We can just go to the next slide, please. To sort of nod to the sort of discussions that the guy was talking about with data, and also what I was saying and alluding to with that uplift in mobile devices being used for payment and travel. All of a sudden you have something in a passenger's, well, not all of a sudden, it's something we're all familiar with, but you have this device in a passenger's hand. We have all this data in a back office system. And really what happens in a contactless world at the moment is the passenger doesn't see what happens until something comes off their bank account at the end of the day or in the middle of the night. We're losing that opportunity to interact with the passenger, to make their lives easier, to help them to understand and negotiate things when they go wrong, if they get put on the deny list, and to understand actually when there's value just waiting to be taken advantage of, such as they've hit a cap, travel for the next 3 days is free, essentially. So we're working with suppliers and partners such as UrbanThings to try and unlock these benefits for a passenger, and trying to get the data that's in our back office into the passenger's hands. So just to wrap up on the next slide, and it echoes what everyone else has said: collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. That is the end result and our sort of conclusion of all of the work that we've been doing in multi-operator. Really, we have to, as suppliers, approach any of the initiatives that we're looking at for Bus Back Better and even for MaaS with an open mind, to try and break those strongholds that we're used to, where people want to have ownership of parts of the system. And actually, by working together, by opening up APIs and interfaces to the back offices and putting the right data into existing customer channels rather than trying to introduce a new one, we really feel that there's the opportunity to not only deliver Bus Back Better national strategy, but actually the next steps beyond it, and sort of achieving some of the MaaS visions such as Solent outlined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheryll. That was absolutely fascinating. A lot of detail on the back office of ticketing, which makes all of this work. And without it, we wouldn't even be thinking about this. If we can move on to Mike Bartram, the bus policy advisor from Transport Focus, who's going to talk to us a bit more about the passenger end and what passengers really want next. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks very much, Beate. So just to say that Transport Focus used to be called Passenger Focus, And in those days, we were responsible for bus and coach, tram and rail passengers. We've, in the last few years, also taken on responsibility for the users of the main roads in this country, the strategic roads, and we've morphed into transport focus to reflect that. But we are all about the user. That's the key point here. This is going to be quite a high level and relatively short presentation, maybe a relief to some of you, and I hope it's relevant. It maybe provides a little bit of context about the big picture of what's going on at the moment and what passengers have told us they want from an integrated system, but it certainly won't address a lot of the detail that has been in the excellent presentation so far. If I can have the next slide, please. So what we're talking about here is in this country, we have a competitive and deregulated bus services. And these have resulted in a fragmentation of networks, timetables, fares and ticketing. So many of the solutions that we've been talking about already have been as a result of a system that has been set up in a very separate way, so that you're different companies competing against each other. There was somebody asked in the chat about competition and whether data sharing was consistent with that. We've now got a national bus strategy, and the government is driving all bus operators and all local transport authorities towards either a franchising solution, which is like the way in which services are run in London, or commissioned by a central authority and coordinated in one way, or enhanced partnerships. And most authorities are going for enhanced partnerships, and both of these do present opportunities to address this lack of integration. And I think we're not moving away from competition, but we are moving towards a more collaborative form of competition. The Competition and Markets Authority are a consultee on these enhanced partnerships, and we'll see what they think of the approaches that are being taken in the various partnerships. But it seems that there isn't necessarily a contradiction between this and some of the what Sheryll was talking about in terms of sort of multi-operator ticketing and things like that is very much now the buzzwords of the industry. If I can have the next slide, please. So an individual passenger has a choice, or a person has a choice of modes to help them get from A to B. And I think it is quite important to think about the fact that there are different kinds of passengers. There are passengers who are making the same journey, maybe the same commuter journey, over and over and over again, and they've got very familiar with that journey, and they don't really need very much information, thank you very much, unless things are going wrong, in which case they do. And then there are people who are making unfamiliar journeys, you know, maybe those same commuters at the weekend, or people who don't use buses very often, so I think we need to remember that when we're designing these systems and how we're going to reach people in those different sort of markets. And so potentially we're looking at, you know, car, train, tram, coach, bus, demand responsive transport, taxis, active travel, or any combination of those. I think that's sort of implicit in the MaaS sort of offer. And what passengers are looking for, not in every case, but I mean, a broad rule of thumb would be, you know, I'm looking at which combination of modes do I use? How do I get from A to B? Which individual mode do I use? It's like, what's fastest? What's the simplest and most convenient? What's the best price? And those are the sort of, you know, the initial questions a lot of people are going to be asking. Can I have the next slide, please? So the sort of information people need, origin and they'll have their own origin and destination points in their own mind. They may not be able to describe them in exactly the same way that a system does, so it's important that those things are aligned. Obviously a railway station straightforward, but you know, some spot on a road, it may not be obvious. They want to know the frequency, they want to know the journey time of each available mode and the combinations of modes. And I've had recent experience of this just before the pandemic hit. I was in Birmingham, and we did some mystery shopping, and we actually tried to do this. We went up to the station, New Street Station. We tried to make a journey to Merry Hill using our phones and trying to research the information that was available in terms of different websites and phone lines and the information centre. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But the comparative costs are very important. It's important even for a website to be set up clearly so that people can actually make the comparisons they want to make. And so many of our information systems and websites at the moment are set up in order to provide the costs of particular modes and sometimes particular companies on their journeys, rather than to give you a sort of easy frame of reference for comparing a particular journey. Other considerations that people might want to know about, particularly at the moment with COVID and maybe with this new variant coming in, how busy is the bus going to be? We know that from our own research that there is an incredibly high correlation at the moment between passenger satisfaction and their feelings and their satisfaction with their feelings of safety. And when we did that research a few months ago, that was by far the most highly correlated factor. There are also considerations about the reliability and punctuality of the service. Yes, okay, that's the journey time on the timetable. What is it actually? You know, can I rely on it? Are there likely to be traffic jams at this time of day? Issues around accessibility are going to be very important for certain kinds of passenger, for disabled people or people carrying heavy shopping, luggage facilities, etc. And emissions, maybe in the wake of COP26, more people are asking about the relative emissions of different modes and wanting to factor that into their decisions, particularly if they're going to make a decision not about an individual journey, but about, you know, a new way of traveling, you know, as a routine from maybe if they've got a new job somewhere, for example. And also where to get on and how to pay, the basics in enabling you to actually take advantage of that journey information. If I can have the next slide, please. So where can passengers get help? And obviously you're developing some very important and interesting solutions today that have been discussed. But from a member of the public stuck at Birmingham New Street, for example, you know, how do you know which websites there are? So maybe you go into Google and you just sort of type in journey travel from here to here and you see what happens. And then you get a whole set of different websites that you can sort of follow up. Google Maps is very popular. Young people told us in the research we did that that was the app that they used the most when they were traveling, and other apps have to work very hard in order to justify their space on young people's phones because they don't have endless space for different apps, and so they need to have a reason to put a different app onto their phone. Phone lines like Travel Line, you know, awareness of these, you know, it's on bus stops, but not everyone immediately thinks of Travel Line, but they have a lot of data about, you know, the timetables, and it's a very important source of information if it's used. And then again in the station there was maps, there was posters, there was screens in the stations and interchanges, all of this giving information. And a travel centre, I have to say, this proved to be my favourite, the most efficient and quickest and most reliable way of getting the information. Just go to one very well-informed person. They tell you everything you need to know. You know, the best way of doing it is this. And if you trust them, which I did, and actually it backed up what we'd already decided on the basis of spending quite a long time looking at websites, it's a very good option in those large stations and places that and city centre venues that have the facilities for having a travel centre. And of course it's also joined up there. It isn't just one mode, it isn't just one company. If I can have the next slide, please. So we did some research quite a long time ago now, some of this on bus passenger priorities for improvement. We do this actually from time to time, and the most recent version we did was in 2020. But the one that is perhaps asked the most relevant questions to this session was the one we did in 2010, where we looked at integrated ticketing, and we the rank for multi-operator bus tickets was that it was the fourth most important priority for improving bus services for passengers, and multimodal tickets was the ninth most important. Now this is out of a list of 30 that people were presented with, so that represents, I mean, anything in the top 10 is a really high priority. Now I'm not sure that things have improved so dramatically over the last 10 years. It may be something to do with the research methodology and the questions asked, but by 2020, multi-operator tickets had fallen to 15th, from 4th to 15th in that list of 30, maybe a slightly different list. And multi-operator no premium fares, well, we didn't ask about them in our research, but I've done some work with Transport for Greater Manchester and looked at some of their research, and multi-operator no premium fares proved extremely popular in some recent research done for bus franchising and for the consultation that was run on that in Greater Manchester. If I can have the next slide, please. So the basic principles, overarching principles for passengers are that fares and tickets should be simple and easy to understand, that they should have confidence that they're getting the best value ticket. If you think of somewhere like London, nobody needs to know. Everyone seems to trust the fact that if they tap in and tap out, use their card or whatever, the Transport for London will organise the best fare for them. You can use it on the trains as well as the underground and the buses. It's possibly why Andy Burnham, in an article that he wrote yesterday, or an interview that he gave yesterday, was talking up all the time the fact that Greater Manchester wanted the London model or something like that. And I suspect in terms of confidence and trust and integrated ticketing, you know, that's probably the gold standard, at least in this country. Transparency about what's on offer, and a seamless experience that integrates finding the information and buying the ticket. And again, I think it was mentioned, I think possibly by one or two of the contributors so far, that it's very clear that passengers don't want to spend all this time on a website or an app and then get to the point where they're told what the journey is, what the mode is, what the ticket is, and then they've got to go somewhere else to pay for it. They want to do it there and then. They've got to this point. It's terribly frustrating to be sent somewhere else at that point. Next slide, please. Disruption information. So this brings in sort of real-time information. Obviously, there is a lot going on with driver shortages in the bus industry at the moment, and we are approaching winter and maybe even today, some particularly bad weather. So there's sort of general cancellations which can't necessarily be predicted, and there's exceptional ones where there may be high demands on a system where things are going wrong. As I say, at the moment, there are a lot of cancellations, some of which are last minute, some of which are slightly more programmed the day before or even a week before as a result of the driver shortages. Delays, the real-time information, obviously it's important that that's accessible and joined up. I just wanted to say something about the approach that was taken to joined up information for the tube network. When Tim O'Toole took over the London Underground, and I was at Transport for London, I was head of consultation at that point, the first thing he did was to introduce a system whereby in every underground station, no matter how small, there was a board or an electronic display at the front that said which lines, if any, were disrupted: severe disruption, slight disruption, or running a good service. Now, what's really important there is that the whole system of the underground was seen as a network, and so many people do change from one line to another that, not knowing, I mean, there's no point going to Green Park to change on the Piccadilly line if the Piccadilly line's not running. So you need to know that before you make the decision at Earl's Court, where I was based. You can get the District line instead, make the journey another way. So having that joined up information from the start of a journey, really important in real time. If I can have the next slide, please. I think this is pretty much my last slide. Just not forgetting about the customer service elements. And if somebody's got a problem when they're trying to find out information, or a problem with the ticket, where do they go for help? And that help should be in a form that's sort of accessible to them and useful to them. And who should take responsibility for delays and misconnections on multi-leg journeys? Perhaps a difficult question to answer, but in our role of dealing with appeals from rail passengers when things have gone wrong for them, there is often an issue about sort of misconnections and things like that, and different operators saying, well, it's not our fault. So I think, just click onto the last slide, but it's probably just got my contact details on it. I think that's it from me, and I'm happy to hand back to Beate now.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for highlighting both many of the possibilities that mobility as a service and linking together passenger data and payment and operators give us, and also some of the issues that we might come across if we do that. If I can invite everyone else back into the webinar forum, onto the platform. If you're not sure what the words are these days, now that we're virtual. Hi everyone. I've got questions. They have been coming in thick and fast. Chris, there are a couple of very specific Solent questions that were asked.
Sure.
Does Solent Go have a daily or longer periods capping facility?
Solent Go at the moment is not really a capping function, but it is a multi-operator ticket. So you can buy a multi-operator 1 day or 7 day or 30-day ticket for either a city or the whole region. So it sort of obviates the need for capping in that respect. We are planning to launch a hopper ticket next year, which would be multi-operator, so a 60-minute ticket essentially allowing you to change between. Capping would be something that would come as part of the BSIPs and enhanced partnerships, which we're in discussions with our local authority partners about.
And also, do you have to have control of the ferries to make this work? A few people have been asking about ferries. It seems to really worry everyone on the questions panel.
No, we don't. So our model is that we resell tickets. So I mean, our bus operators are private companies, ferry operators are private companies as well. We're looking to come to arrangements with them whereby we resell their tickets. So no, we don't. If we had all day, we could have lots of discussions about ferries in the Solent, but the short answer is no.
Thank you. There are quite a few questions around paying for these innovations and mobility service. I'm going to ask Guy and Sheryll questions because I think there's a bit of an analogy. People are asking, how is mobility as a service going to be paid for? Because it's an additional cost. Is it a cost for operators, for government, for the Transport Authority? Who's it a cost for? But I wondered if I could go first to Sheryll and ask, Littlepay, obviously, when we moved to EMV, more on buses and rail and in transport, was the resistance originally from operators paying additional costs for processing, or did they see the reduction in the cost of handling cash as a equal compensation for the costs of taking cards effectively?
No, it's a great question, and I think that was the resistance? Yes, 100%. And I think it's the same as anything. When you're introducing something new, you need to ensure you're comparing apples with apples, and that's definitely not what was the case because it was something brand new. There's a new cost element to it. But when you look at cash handling, and not just cash handling, but that potential to reduce other costs such as the card costs if they're issuing ITSO smart cards and things like that for that demographic, it quickly just faded into the background, I would say, overall, because it was different, and the convenience and things that they were able to see, the uplifts, uplifts even in passenger groups, I think was something that price started to fall to the background, and it started to be, well, what else can we do with this now once it was in and once it was running?
Guy, do you want to talk about what you see as potentially who pays? And I might ask Chris as well, what the actuality is on the ground.
Sure, it's a really interesting question, and it is very much a big question at the moment. I think ultimately it has to be a blend of the government's paying, the passengers paying, and the operators paying. But I don't think that there's any, there's no expectation that anyone should be taking an unfair burden of cost here. I think the key here is that this is an investment in improving patronage by making the systems more appealing. And so what that does is it drives up the number of passengers that are boarding and can introduce new economies of scale within the system as well, and increases fare revenue. So I think what we're talking about here is like I say, making an investment to bring more people on board. And so that initial cost perhaps is covered under Bus Back Better of getting these systems live. But as the platforms are are building up and more people are being brought on board, patronage is increasing, fare revenue is increasing, that cost then gets shared out between the stakeholders.
Chris, what's the actuality of the Solent?
I think the actuality is that no one wants to pay, but yeah, someone has to. We're finding that just like Guy and Sheryll have been saying, it's about finding a mixture that works and finding a sort of collaborative arrangement. So for us, we've been very fortunate to receive the capital funding to develop the MaaS platform for the first, and the operation cost for the first few years, but that doesn't cover either the cost of sale during this period, neither does it cover the platform costs in the long term. And we think that I mean, there are a variety of ways you can raise the money. Our position is we don't really want to be charging customers any more than they would pay anywhere else, so that the tickets are available for the same price they are anywhere else, which means that ideally we pass on a very small sliver of costs to operators to sell their tickets through us. As Guy was just saying, by increasing patronage, you're essentially growing the market, so it shouldn't be any loss to them. I mean, there are other potential sources of funding, whether they be public or private sector, but that's what we see as probably the most sustainable. And actually, the key is to get lots of people using the platform, because the more customers you have, the bigger market share you have, the smaller sliver of cost you need to pass on to anyone as a proportion of the whole.
Thank you. We're also getting a lot of questions about deregulation, re-regulation, data and pricing. So I'm going to try and sort of take a kind of a super question. Is deregulation, does it prevent data sharing? I think maybe just to clear that one up, Guy?
I think, yeah, so it's an interesting one. If we look at it from the competitive angle, I think something that I touched on in my presentation is that one of the issues we're seeing historically is that because of deregulation, operators are competitive with each other, and so they don't want to share their data and they don't want to be giving access to each other's tickets. But I think that one of the really key points that I was trying to thread through what I was saying was that this isn't about a competition between operators anymore. This is about a competition between bus and other public transport and the private car. And so sharing data doesn't have to be a commercially sensitive thing. We're talking about helping cities and operators understand where passengers want to go and when they want to make those journeys, so that the service can be improved for everyone and more people come on board.
Thank you. Mike, do you have concerns from a transport focus point of view about deregulation and data?
Well, I mean, we deregulated in 1985 or 84, 85. It's a long time ago. If anything is happening at the moment, it's re-regulation, albeit only patchily. Transport for Greater Manchester has, the Mayor Andy Burnham has made a decision to re-regulate effectively, to take control of Greater Manchester's buses back. And there are, I think, 3 other authorities at the moment who are looking at franchising seriously and therefore not immediately developing an enhanced partnership. Obviously, the government's bus open data approach is bringing in a lot of data and making that available that wouldn't otherwise have been the case. And I think the general mood is towards more cooperation than before rather than less cooperation, but how far that's going to go, I'm not quite sure.
I think there's a sort of a linked question which is about multi-operator ticketing and how that can be made cost effective. Because we're moving to an enhanced partnership model for most authorities, there's still the commercial element for ticket pricing in enhanced partnerships. So how can people be sure that the multi-operator ticket that they're buying is actually the best deal, and is there a way of actually ensuring that within the current framework? I don't know if Sheryll, if you're someone that could answer that.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, because there are many multi-operator sort of schemes that already exist. So there is already that concept, and typically the majority that we came across, there is a value there. Maybe a slight uplift for convenience, but better value in terms of being able to go cross operator. Rarely is it hugely penalising the passenger because they just don't get sold then. What happens when you move to the contactless world is that you're taking that element of choice away from the passenger, so there has to be value delivered. You're going to cap them automatically for transferring on multiple services. There has to be that element of trust that they're not going to be charged more than going separately with two operators. And so that anyone that we're working with, we have to work through those sort of single operator and multi-operator cost models to ensure that that value is there, or else it's just the passengers just won't want to use it, and actually it'll push them away from contactless because there's no choice otherwise.
Chris, is that a practical issue that you're working through at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Sheryll. I mean, from a customer perspective, the model that we have at the moment asks them to make decisions quite a long way in advance of when they're traveling. So if you know that you're going to need multi-operator ticketing, then sure, you buy your Solent Go ticket for a day or a week or however long it is. But then if your plans change, you've bought a ticket that's too expensive or more expensive than you needed. And I think that's where we want to get to, is that you or indeed the system is making the best choice at the time of travel, so that you're not asking someone to interrogate 57 different fare databases just to find out what the best option for their journey to the shops is. And I think that's where we want the system to be doing a lot of the hard work, and indeed our journey planners should be presenting the options, you know, in terms of time, in terms of cost, in terms of convenience, to allow people to make that best choice for themselves. But it's the ticketing pricing strategy as much as the framework of the tickets that's really important, and that's where it comes back to these enhanced partnerships and the BSIPs that are being developed now.
Thank you. Guy, you look like you want to add something.
Yeah, perhaps I could add to that as well. I think that there's a couple of components in the trust, isn't there? There's the policy side of things in terms of how much should the ticket cost. But there's also on the trust side, there's a transparency question, and that's where having this shared transport data can allow us to provide better transparency to passengers. I touched on during my presentation the example of giving passengers notifications on their phone as they're going through their journey, telling the passenger how much you're charging them as you go, telling them when they've hit their caps. I think giving that transparency and that additional information creates the trust and the peace of mind as well.
Yeah, and there are alternatives to having a phone. You know, you can print things on paper tickets just as easily as you can print them, as you can push them out as a notification.
Exactly.
There is this sort of the other theme that keeps coming through in terms of the thing, and maybe you can take this as one piece, is who is responsible, who's the ultimate holder of the data or the writer of the ticket or the guarantor of the system. Mike, do you want to kind of, who should be in your, I mean, I think we probably know roughly who is, but who should be, should it be the Transport for the North, Transport for Greater Manchester? At what level should that kind of overarching piece of information and guarantee sit? Mike, that was a question for you. I'm sorry, was it not clear?
Sorry, I didn't realise that was a question for me. I mean, I think what's important is that passengers know where to go for the information. It doesn't really matter to them what the answer to that question is, who has the information, so long as they know who it is and that it gives them the information they need. I just wanted to say in relation to the last conversation that one of the key principles is important to passengers is flexibility, and that business about being able to change your plans on the day or whatever. Unfortunately, we've got systems, for example, on the national railways, where very often there's a built-in incentive to providing to buying your ticket well in advance. So the further in advance you buy it, the cheaper it gets. So there's then that trade-off between losing your flexibility but getting a cheaper deal, and then maybe having to throw away your ticket at the last minute.
Yeah, no, pricing is very interesting. I think as we've started to go back to rail and public transport, I've had a lot of people say, can't people just tell me how much it's going to cost, where I've bought ticket to the same conference for a lot less or a lot more than one of my colleagues. So you know there is a we like to try and market things to flatten the peak and things like that, but then there is also a basic transparency issue, isn't there, about ticketing and people wanting to have some kind of baseline knowledge of what they're letting themselves in for. That wasn't a question. So the question. So I don't know, Guy. Do you want to say, who do you think should be the kind of ultimate umbrella for all of the data, all of the ticketing, all of the last port of call in the system?
Sure. I think ultimately the data belongs to either the city or the passenger in terms of whose data it actually is. But I think that the key is here, we're not talking about taking, you know, when we talk about shared data, this isn't taking data out of one person's pot and putting it into another. It's about linking them all together through a central platform that can aggregate that and make it more accessible. So I think perhaps a short answer to the question is the data almost stays where it is today. We're not trying, no one's necessarily proposing that we move the data around. It's simply connecting that data together is the key.
But in terms of insights and shaping services, because obviously data is a two-way thing. If you suddenly see, if you have a platform, you might see demand for people making trips or not being able to make trips by public transport. At what point does someone take action and say, right, we need something here that does X, does Y?
Yeah, so in terms of acting on the data, then I think it becomes a collaborative effort between the stakeholders. I think, you know, you have passengers are directly and indirectly sharing that through the behavior that they're exhibiting or through specific feedback they're giving to surveys or through apps. And in terms of accessing the data to see these insights, I think you have planning departments at cities and authorities, and you have different members of the operators themselves who can view this data. And I think that when it comes to a service improvement, I think that it splits between policy and operator in terms of changing routes or changing services. I think the insights have to be taken by the operators and the government on that side.
Chris,
I was just going to, yeah, I think that often this conversation is framed in a negative sense in terms of people are worried they're losing access to data. And I think actually it's the opposite. You know, from our perspective, a bus operator who joins our MaaS platform will have access to all of the data on their customers making their trips, and their competitors won't have access to the customers on their trips and vice versa. But also we'll be able to give them information on, in suitably protected ways, of course, where their customers have come from. So it's not just customers appearing on a bus and then disappearing when they get off. It's actually, oh, well, did you know that lots of your customers are getting off here and then jumping on an e-scooter? Did you know that lots of people are making multimodal trips by rail and then by bus? So I think there's a real positive aspect to this around data sharing, which allows for much better decisions, not just by the public authorities, as Guy was just saying, but also by the transport operators themselves, who will have a bit more confidence in terms of service planning, service provision, and so on.
And in terms of the Solent, you have a couple of cities in the area, don't you? And the Isle of Wight. So how's it working in terms of who does what within that arrangement?
Yeah, so from a planning perspective, I mean, we as Solent Transport mainly assist with the strategic studies and so on. We also own the transport model, and the transport model is waiting to be fed by MaaS data when it's up and running. The local authorities are generally responsible for the schemes and improvements in their own areas, and of course that's in conjunction with the transport operators themselves. So it's a multi-party thing, and that's where I think another reason why the MaaS platform will be so valuable is that it gives those insights to everyone and just allows better decision making.
Thank you. So some interesting questions coming in. The yield management pricing, this decision on what we do, is it a generational issue? Are older people not used to variable pricing in travel, hotels and haircuts, whereas younger people are growing up with that being the norm? Can't someone just tell me the price wane over the next decade or so? I'm kind of looking between Sheryll and Mike on this, because I suspect you've both got some insight into consumer behaviour and their predilections. Mike,
I don't think we've really got. I mean, we haven't done research on that specific question. I mean, I think it may be dangerous to generalise just because somebody's over a certain age. I mean, there are different personality types and people with different experiences, and so it may be that some older people are very, very adept at using the technology and finding deals, and they're constantly on there using the internet. I'm not one of those, by the way, as you've probably already gathered, but I think maybe Sheryll has something to add, and that's as much as I can say about it, really.
Yeah, I think for me, what we're seeing is that sort of finding a deal, finding that best value, that's back to that retail mode, having to figure out what you need before you need it, getting the best version of it, and then traveling. And I think what we're trying to knock on the head is actually, you don't need to do that. Just travel, because there is a cost, and you'll be charged the best version of that cost you can based on the context of your journey. And that's what sort of pay as you go is doing. And the interesting part of that sort of tap on, tap off solution is we're finding, one of our operators said to us recently, tap on, tap off has the lowest interaction rate with customers. Now that's going to be across age groups. There's all sorts of stats coming out now, sort of post-COVID, that you've even got 35% of the 70 pluses getting involved in mobile payments, because it's just more easy to access that sort of way of paying now. So I think demographic out of the equation, the fact that tap on, tap off, it has that lowest interaction rate, it's sort of a spike that we see. When you first introduce any sort of new ticketing, any sort of new initiative that's pay as you go, that trust, that transparency has to be built up. You have to be able to see what you're paying. Then you don't look again until something seems a bit out of the ordinary. Again, if you've got transparency, you should be able to quite easily self-service there, not have to do a lot of digging, and correct it where it might be wrong. I think it just opens up a whole new way of traveling and taking that part out of the equation. There's a lot of complexity around how do we get somewhere, what's the best way to do that, and then just trust that there's a method of payment that you can that is accepted, whatever you're going to get on, and that you'll be charged the best amount possible. If that makes sense.
I think final question, because it sort of leads on to this, because you're looking at this, like we develop trust, but also how far are users actually recognised as stakeholders in this whole evolution? What actual controls do they have? I don't know who's looking keen on starting kicking that one off. People
I'm happy to kick it off a bit. So I think I touched on 3 key stakeholders in my presentation, and one of those is the users and the passengers. I think it's absolutely essential to recognise that the passengers and the users are critical to the success of these systems. And in terms of controls, I suppose we can talk about the ability of the passenger to communicate with the authority or the operator. And I think that implementing these kind of systems with shared data creates a much more bi-directional communication between the operators and the passengers. It becomes a lot easier for that feedback to be passed through. Like I mentioned a minute ago, you have implicit feedback from passengers displaying their behaviour, and you can have literal feedback as well, where passengers are able to reach out to operators or reach out to the authorities and express it. But I think ultimately the passenger has to be recognised as one of the most essential stakeholders alongside authorities and operators, because they're the ones that we're trying to get on board, and they're the ones who are going to pay for the fares.
Chris, do you have how are passengers involved in configuring your future transport zone?
I'd like to say that they're at the centre of everything, and I'm sure we would all say the same thing. I mean, the way that we're making that real, I suppose, is through a lot of research, a lot of stakeholder conversations, focus groups, through universities. Traffy, our developer, have been doing customer research as well in terms of how we present options to customers. We're working with behavioural insights team. We're hosting stakeholder events. I hosted one yesterday. It's critical that this is both well known, well marketed, and well used, because if it isn't, then frankly it's not really much use, is it? So without those elements in place, we will be another government project that has a lot of funding, does a lot of work, and then it just sort of disappears off into the ether, and that's absolutely not where we want to end up at the end of this project.
And how do you get beyond people who already use buses and rail? How's that being? How's moving people off cars going for you?
I've been interested to note a few times people have been talking about bus versus car, and I think that's not quite the way we see it. Actually, we would see that individual customers have lots of different choices and preferences, and we do want to tackle car dependency, and we do want to reduce the usage of the private car, but we think the way to do that is to bring car drivers into the MaaS environment. So the journey planner will allow you to plan a journey by car. It will allow you to plan a journey by car plus park and ride or other options. We'll also be bringing things like car sharing, car rental, potentially things like peer-to-peer car rental or pay-as-you-go car insurance, essentially to try and break that model of I own a car, it's on my driveway, therefore I drive. But I think there's a little bit more to it than just promoting bus and saying buses are great, get on the bus, because that will work for some people, but it won't work for a lot of people. And so we're trying to recognize, genuinely from a customer perspective and a sort of retail perspective, what can we do to make using MaaS, make using public and active travel the best option for people for most of their trips.
Thanks. Sheryll?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, the MaaS elements that we speak about, they're kind of the foundation of that bus back better. How do you link up rural services where it doesn't actually just make sense to throw a load of regular bus routes at it? You want to look more at demand responsive. How do we get public transport just in general to make sense for people, to be a good option, so that when they do try it, they realize it's easy, and it's things like, don't move the bus stops away from the train station, have the buses run at the same have the bus wait on the train coming in if the train's late. All sorts of little initiatives, I think, that are just gonna really make it easier. I don't think this is pay by contactless, have the data available, yeah, let's have a nice result that says you should take this end-to-end journey. It's much more than that, and I think that Bus Back Better, MaaS implementations, everything that we're working on, bringing that sort of central data hub to all stakeholders, are all building blocks to sort of getting us towards that vision where public transport becomes realistic and viable for people in the right circumstances.
Thank you. And Mike, how should passengers and future passengers be engaged in this?
I mean, it's about testing, it's about research, and what Chris was saying. I think one of the best pieces of research we've done, it was actually in train stations on ticket machines. And we had a researcher standing next to a member of the public trying to work out what ticket to buy and how to pay for it. One of the fascinating takeaways that I took from this was absolutely intuitive to me, is the sequence. Is that you're asked something at the wrong time, or you've got an option, you miss it, and then it's like a game of snakes and ladders. You get right to the end, and then you realise that there must have been there was something you wanted to be asked, and you hadn't realised you'd already been asked it. So it's just about working through with passengers, with testing, the way in which how do people's minds work? What if they're trying to find out information? What is the question they're coming in with? And how can you address that in an intuitive way? I found very few websites which say, for example, new to the bus, want to make a journey on it. This is what step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And if you work that out, it'd be probably true for 90% of passengers. So I think it pays to do a bit of research and some testing.
Thank you. So we're almost at the end of our webinar, nearly at 12 o'clock. Are there any final thoughts that anyone would like to share with us, just to round up Sheryll?
I think mine is just, you know, going by the breadth of the panelists we've got and the sort of views that we've all had. For me, it's just about, to make everything that we're doing a success, it's about looking at what's happening just now and kind of reflecting on what Mike's just said there. You know, don't ignore the trends, don't ignore the behaviours and the habits that are currently happening. When we introduce new multi-operator schemes, MaaS schemes, you know, let's be resonant on what's there and build on it, complement it, and just leverage it really, to rather than pushing something new on top, which just makes it all noisier and messier and contrary to what we're all trying to do.
Thanks. Chris?
I think it's just important to get things out there, isn't it? This is an industry where people have been talking about MaaS for so many years, and we're on the cusp of having real platforms. I mean, Guy mentioned in his presentation, I mentioned in mine, you know, these are real. They're not theoretical concepts anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of the questions that people have about models of ownership and data protection and customer interaction and so on, watch this space, because next year we'll be starting to answer those questions, and we'll have some real insights, we'll have real data to inform how this will look, and then that will inform how this all rolls out across the country, of course. And you know, it'll be really interesting to see which are the platforms that sort of establish themselves, which come and go, what the market looks like in a few years' time. It's a really exciting time for mobility.
Thanks. Guy?
Thanks. I think, firstly, I absolutely agree with what Chris and Sheryll have just said, but I would say as my closing thoughts, a lot of these technologies and systems and ecosystems exist and are out there, they're just all separated. And so I think that the most important thing is to look at what we've got today, work with what we've got, get things deployed with what's available, and then look at iterating. I think it's very easy to, as Chris just said, it's very easy to fall down a trap of idealizing and spending years talking about what MaaS could be and what we could do in the future. But I think we've got a brilliant opportunity now with Bus Back Better and with the various MaaS and future transport zones that are happening. We've got a brilliant opportunity to take what is existing and available now, get it deployed, get it in people's hands and get it working. And then we can look at adding the next steps.
Thank you. And Mike, from a passenger perspective?
Just keep it simple. I mean, we've got a very unnecessarily complex way in which we've organized our transport systems and different modes over a long period of time. And there's the risk that in trying to navigate that, we introduce too much functionality too quickly and intimidate at least people like me who are rather sort of Luddites. I think start with the simple basic stuff that's going to relate to everyone before you try and add on too many sort of bells and whistles. That's what I'd say.
Thank you very much indeed to my panel, to Mike Bartram, Guy Sutherland, Chris Hillcoat and Sheryll Ricketts, and also to UrbanThings for sponsoring this webinar. I hope everyone's found it really interesting, and we had many of their questions answered. Sorry we couldn't quite do all of them in half an hour. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.